Let's turn to our first story here. Zimbabwe, where a recent Al Jazeera documentary, The Gold Mafia, has been making a lot of waves, not just in Southern Africa, but around the world. Al Jazeera is a pretty big network and raised a lot of different issues. And we are very happy to be joined as we sort through all of this by Rutindo Matinyarare, who is the chairperson of the Zimbabwe Anti-Sanctions Movement and the founder of Zimbabweans Unite Against U.S. War and Sanctions. Rutindo, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me again.
Well, we are very happy to have you. The Al Jazeera documentary obviously has made a lot of waves. And, last year, 2022, Zimbabwe had its largest ever production of gold. And now this documentary has come out, The Gold Mafia, it's called, implying that all of this is somehow, fraudulent and corrupt and not benefiting the Zimbabwean people. The government is now freezing people's accounts, which I think to many people has maybe raised the credence of the Al Jazeera allegations. But you were one of the people who've been pushing back on this documentary, Rutindo, and I'm curious, how you're responding to both these allegations from Al Jazeera and what seems to be some confirmation that at least perhaps some of it could be true based on the government's own actions.
Thank you so much for that opportunity. I think the very first thing that you just confirmed now that Zimbabwe has just broken the record of gold production in the past 2 centuries, forever, actually. And so that means that during the period that we had colonization, in which exploitation of this gold was a very major goal, within the time that the colonizer was able to actually exploit the cheapest and easiest to reach gold. But right now, we've got a record-breaking year last year. Now, that goes on to show that maybe the assumption that Zimbabwean gold is actually being swindled out of the country is actually false. Because if we are having more submissions of gold to the government, to fidelity printers, and this gold is actually being taxed, it is being purified in Zimbabwe or refined in Zimbabwe, it goes then to debunk the allegation that Zimbabwean gold is being swindled out of the country or it's being smuggled out of the country. We also believe that the Al Jazeera documentary itself did not fully understand the gold value chain. So the gold value chain in Zimbabwe is divided into two. We've got the major producers of gold, which are the commercial gold miners. And then on the other hand, we've got the small scale miners that produce 60% of the gold. Now, the small scale miners, or what we call artisanal miners, are people that have been formalized by the government. When they mine their gold, they mine it for themselves as individuals, and then they sell it to buyers or they sell it to government. Now, when they sell their gold, they sell it at market rate less 4%, and they also sell it according to the quality that they've produced and smelted at. So a lot of times you're looking at anything from 98% to maybe 80%. And so when they produce this gold, if it's 80%, they go and look for market price at 80% less the 4% that is supposed to be making the margin for the buyers, for the sellers. And then they also pay a 1% tax there. Now, once that happens, it means that 80 to 95% of the value of that gold less 4% has already stayed in Zimbabwe. Then the buyer needs to go and get this gold refined so that they can take it to global markets. So by the time they do this, they pay a refinery fee. And once they get to the refinery, it belongs to the government of Zimbabwe. They then have to pay tax and royalties. So by the time they're exporting the product out of the country, they're left with a margin of about maybe 3-4%. And what the secret is, by the time you've got 4% left for the seller, that means that the seller is now the owner of the gold because he's paid everything, including his royalties and the money that belongs to the small scale miners and left that in the country. The big producers, on the other hand, they have to produce. Their production can be monitored by the government of Zimbabwe on output. So, for instance, if you move a ton of soil to get 2 grams of gold, they can actually the government can actually go and measure the amount of soil that they've moved to determine how much gold they might be submitting. And then they measure that against what it is that the big scale miners who produce 40% of the gold are submitting to the government. And then they're allowed to export that once it's been submitted, smelted, refined, and taxed. So we are struggling to understand where this smuggling is happening when the value chain is so perfect and easy to detect. And when we're also seeing an increase of 48% gold submission to the government ever since the new president came in 2017. So we're struggling with that. And you asked another question. I think you said, what was the other question? Sorry.
The government has been freezing accounts and putting out many statements that sort of,
Right,
I think many
right,
people feel it's
right.
lending credence to the charges.
Thank you so much. I think the government is shooting itself in the foot, but why it's shooting itself in the foot is the reason why organizations like mine exist to fight sanctions. But we're no longer just fighting sanctions that come directly from the United States and the EU and the United Kingdom. We're also beginning to fight the use of the Financial Action Task Force to actually internationalize the United States sanctions. So the Americans have realized that their sanctions are under attack. They're realizing there's no legitimacy of their sanctions within the United Nations. So they're beginning to use other methods, which were devised in 2001 when you actually read a book by Juan Zaret that is called The Treasury's War. In The Treasury's War, Juan Zaret went to say, we went to FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, and we asked them to start putting more screws on money laundering, financing of terrorism, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in countries that are not friendly to the United States to deprive them of finances. So we've seen an internationalization of US sanctions when the United States has enemies, they start saying that those enemies are money laundering, those enemies are involved in financing of terrorism, and they're financing a proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. But when you look at all these allegations, you do not see any proof that there is, for instance, in the gold of Zimbabwe, any money laundering. Because for money laundering to take place, there has to be a predicate crime. That is a crime that generates a profit, and then that profit being put into the legitimate banking system through a Zimbabwean bank. So the moment that proceeds from a crime are taken and they put into a bank, they put into an account of a legitimate person, the laundering has taken place. And everything that was said in the documentary was that laundering, if it was going to take place, because there was a hypothetical situation, as Al Jazeera didn't really have dirty money, but there was a hypothetical situation that if they did have dirty money, it would be cleaned by the opening of accounts in Dubai or the money being put into bank accounts of people that have gold trading licenses from Dubai and Zimbabwe. The moment that money would hit an account in Dubai, that means the cleaning has taken place there. So the money laundering or the laundry of that money takes place in Dubai, not Zimbabwe. So we felt that there was a far stretch to try and bring Zimbabwe into the equation. But this is what we believe. We believe that they were trying to bring Zimbabwe into the equation because Zimbabwe is already under sanctions. The least it needs is to be put on the Financial Action Task Force gray list or blacklist. So the Zimbabwean government is acting desperately to try and stop the Financial Action Task Force actually gray listing them. And the way they're doing this is by conforming to the 40 regulations of the Financial Action Task Force, which include the need to block accounts, the need to do what are called non-prosecutorial seizures of taking of property, holding of property while investigations happen. But one of the things we are saying in our case in the South African courts is any time that you block accounts, you seize assets, and you do that without hearing, without due process, that in itself is a violation of the Universal Bill of Rights. It is a contravention of human rights. And this is what we're fighting in the courts in South Africa to say people must be tried first before they are punished and deprived of their ability to transact or to be able to undertake economic activities because of the blocking of their accounts. So we believe that these Financial Action Task Force rules are illegal. We believe that they're contrary to international law. And the Financial Action Task Force itself is a G7 creation. It is not an international creation. It's a unilateral organization created by former colonizers. And I don't believe that it's got legitimacy. The government of Zimbabwe playing along and conforming to the Financial Action Task Force is an indication of the government of Zimbabwe playing along with colonial rules and accepting to continue to go under colonial rules that are not being spread out evenly across the world. Now, you remember in 2008, we had the crash of the banking system in America that lost the world over $40 trillion. We know that most of the terrorist organizations in the world are financed by the United States through the American banking system. We know that most of the oil companies and mining companies that belong to Western countries are actually institutions created from colonialism, a crime against humanity. Why is it that when they have their funds put into bank accounts, when they move their profits and move their dividends, that's not considered as money laundering? Yet those are clear predicate crimes and proceeds of crimes that come from colonialism, that come from genocide, and that come from crimes against humanity. It doesn't make sense. It shows that there's discrimination. There's no equitable application of Financial Action Task Force regulations, illustrating that they're not about stopping money laundering, they're not about stopping the financing of terrorism, but in fact, they are about keeping the third world down and keeping what a certain gentleman always says, keeping the core, exploiting the periphery for the benefit of the core.
Mm-hmm.
That's very well said. And one thing that has been a big topic of discussion in Zimbabwe as well as in the DRC has been this issue of cooperatives that empower artisanal miners and how to do mining more fairly. And the Al Jazeera documentary heavily features the Zimbabwe Miners Federation, which says they do that they empower these artisanal miners, excuse me. And in the documentary, the head of the Zimbabwe Miners Federation is presented as this like key figure of corruption that had been previously accused of smuggling. And you've said that the Zimbabwe Miners Federation is actually empowering artisanal miners. So I'm just curious, how do you square that with what was said in the documentary?
Thank you so much for that. Well, for me, I always believe that where there's dispute of fact, then you need to look for evidence. And the best evidence that you can ever look for is numbers. So ever since this lady, Henrietta Rushwaya, became the head of this institution, this institution has given Zimbabwe an increase of 48% of gold submissions to the government of Zimbabwe, meaning that's less gold being smuggled, meaning that that's more people submitting their gold to government. And she is responsible for an institution that controls 1.2 million artisanal miners. Now, I've been on the ground. I've taken my camera, gone to see what it is that is happening in these mines, and we've seen people that grew up as orphans, grew up in villages, grew up on less than $1 a day, lift themselves up from having nothing, from abject poverty, to becoming multimillionaires, from owning more than one mine to owning processing plants to owning smelters. So I've seen this with my own eyes. I've seen people who were nothing become something. But that is exactly the problem with those Zimbabweans that are believing this documentary. A lot of them are professionals. A lot of them are privileged people that grew up in cities, and they have now become a second-class citizen in Zimbabwe because the people that are now occupying the top tier are these miners because they're making money. They're becoming the landlords. They're building the houses. They own the properties. They own the shops. And all of a sudden, you've got PhD graduates, you've got people with master's degrees now renting off properties of people that used to be peasants, people that used to be nothing before. Because of the hierarchical class system that the British had put in Zimbabwe, that is offensive to a lot of these educated people. And this is why you see a resistance to them by the opposition and the elite, the former elite educated class of people, the intellectuals. They can't stand that. And this is what it is that the documentary is feeding into. And
we might have lost Rutendo.
that the resources are no longer controlled by the elites, or the resources are no longer controlled by Western corporations. And we are saying it cannot be that gold mined by peasants becomes dirty or filthy or illegal just because it's mined and just because it doesn't go to market and then bullion market or the London fix. We believe that African resources don't need to go through the London fix, and we believe that the sanctions have actually enabled us to find other avenues to get that gold to market. So Henrietta Rushwaya being a woman makes certain men uncomfortable. Being a woman and achieving the results that she's achieved makes some people feel very comfortable. And it makes the big corporations and the former miners very uncomfortable. Gold that they think the one that they want to buy is now being monopolized. The owners of the gold, which is Zimbabweans. And I think the international community or the Western community is conspiring with the major mining firms to say resources of a country like a Zimbabwe, third world resources, should never be controlled by peasants. But it's not only a third world thing. I don't even think that they want Americans or people in the first world to control factors of production, because then if people control factors of production, they can't be slaves. And that's what we're fighting here. A new world order that wants a few corporations to control everything, and Zimbabwe is doing exactly the opposite. It's almost putting factors of production in the hands of the people, which would be considered as communism or socialism. And we know what socialism and communism are very unpopular words in the West. And that's why you're seeing this resistance. Then, lastly, the gold coin that Zimbabwe has developed, which many people see as a way of Zimbabwe slowly beginning to create a currency backed by resources, is the most biggest sin that Zimbabwe has committed. Because if you remember, Gaddafi was killed for that. Zimbabwe has successfully created such a currency, and that's a threat to the Western world.
No, I think that's a very well taken point. And let me just ask you this lastly before we let you go. So, I mean, what did Al Jazeera really capture here? I mean, you know, they've the way it's done, you know, the sort of secret cameras, and you've got the diplomat saying, well, I can move $1.2 billion. I have diplomatic immunity. I mean, is it a case like, you know, just like the United States or many places where, you know, some subset of people who are involved in some legitimate business are also trying to work their own sideline? Have they totally misconstrued it? Because I think that's like what a lot of people see this and hear this, and it looks and sounds sinister. So it's, you know, you mentioned this a little bit in terms of the role of Dubai earlier, but I just wonder, you know, what did they really capture in some of these conversations that have been presented as, you know, the smoking gun evidence of the corruption?
I think once you really know evidence and you really know what the burden of evidence is, you really realize that a lot of what they had was hearsay. It's conversations that were recorded and then they were edited. So they really are inadmissible in a court of law. But I actually don't believe that it was all hidden camera work, because I saw a lot of normal camera work in a lot of that footage. And it made me wonder why men and women who've made so much money over the years would actually submit themselves to be put on camera to talk about things that they don't talk about. So you look at Macmillan, he's a very wealthy man. Why would he be put on camera and why would he talk? Why would the accountants that we saw, who are well-paid people working for institutions that are dealing in gold, be speaking in front of camera? And I came up with only one conclusion. The one conclusion is that there was no hidden cameras. I believe that the FBI, the CIA have been involved in catching these people out for their own crimes. And I believe that those people were threatened by the United States FBI that they would have their assets forfeited, they would be investigated for certain crimes, financial crimes, that is, and they would be deported to the United States if they were dealing in US dollars. And I believe that they reached an agreement with the US government that they were going to speak in front of camera. And that is why you hear that one of the gentlemen, who is supposedly an accountant of a guy called More Dollars in South Africa, who was doing the books of More Dollars, he's speaking, but apparently he's in a safe house. Al Jazeera says he's in a safe house. Al Jazeera says that he has uprooted his entire life with his family to go and start a new life in what sounds like witness protection. I don't understand what man would jeopardize his salary as an accountant or a chartered accountant in a smuggling operation, in a money laundering operation, to go and then uproot his family to live uncomfortably for the rest of his life, unless the United States had him and they were going to indict him or whatever. And they asked him to spy and speak and to sell out, or to at least sell the people's names that were being given there as money launderers in exchange for freedom. That is how I read into that. You also saw in Dubai there was an auditor who used to work for Ernst and Young, and he became a whistleblower again in this. Why would he do that? Because where is he going to work after this? Where are those accountants ever going to get work when they've got no confidentiality for the institutions they work for? And if they're going to be whistleblowers, they would never get work. But the reason they're jeopardizing themselves, the reason why Macmillan would jeopardize himself, I believe, is because the United States had them speak in front of camera, give out sensitive information in exchange for freedom and in exchange for not being investigated. So I actually think it was deliberate. But I'm also left asking some questions about my own country. that some of the admissions that we've heard where they're legitimizing a documentary that implicates their president, they try to deny what it is that's saying about the president, but they seem to be accepting everything else by arresting people on mere gossip and mere hearsay. I'm beginning to wonder if we don't even have Zimbabweans within the system that are compromised too, that might be under threat of being investigated, might be under threat of their children being taken out of universities in America, might be under threat of secondary sanctions themselves. So they're starting to talk and starting to implicate and to investigate to legitimize a documentary that's basically based on gossip, and that doesn't make sense to me. But this is the problem with sanctions. They come with covert operations, and I believe that this is a covert operation. And if you know the history of Al Jazeera, it was started by two men that were suspected to be the Freuden brothers, suspected to be Mossad agents. And they initially wanted to set up in Saudi Arabia with the BBC, but Saudi Arabia refused, and only then they went to set up in Qatar. And if you remember, the what you call it, the leader of Qatar, who started this and funded this, was actually trained as a British soldier, and so we can actually call him a mercenary, or the equivalent of a British legionnaire. And you know how French legionnaires have been used on the continent to overthrow governments. So it all smells like an American operation, CIA, Mossad, and so forth.
Well, Rutindo, we really appreciate you joining us here and helping us sort through it. And I encourage everybody to check out the work you're doing on social media, a lot of point-by-point examinations of the documentary. And I think for anyone who saw the documentary, they should see what you're talking about as well. Obviously, we'll keep covering this the best we can. But as always, thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for these opportunities, and thank you for fighting imperialism. Thank you so much.